All right, let's talk about Purdue. We're going to stay in the sport of basketball. Purdue, they just took a loss to Ohio State. Will they be able to bounce back against Michigan at home on national television this Friday? Purdue, like I said, they took a loss at home for the first time in 500,000 games. I'm not sure what the number is, but Ohio State 73-70 manages to slip past the Boilermakers. And now they're going to stay at home. They're going to take on number 21 Michigan in Mackey Arena, and that's the battle for control of second place in the Big Ten. Let's talk about this Ohio State loss first. Ohio State really put their best effort on the floor on the road following a 3-game skid. So Ohio State on a 3-game losing streak, coming to Mackey Arena, and they put their best basketball on the floor. And it felt like Purdue didn't quite have the manpower across the floor to keep up. Micah Parrish went off. Purdue shot poorly. They were again under 50% from the field. It wasn't a bad game, all things considered, but there really wasn't enough intensity to outpace IU, and I partially want to blame that on the scheduling. They're coming off the West Coast swing. Ohio State was hungry for a win. Purdue played well. This loss is acceptable. It's disappointing, but it's acceptable, and it's acceptable because when you look at the schedule and the context of this game, you realize how difficult this game would have been to win. Yes, you're at home, and I don't want to blame this on the Big Ten. I don't want to blame this on the schedule makers. I'm not blaming the loss on the conference or anyone that works for it, because really they did the best they could, right? Obviously, you're trying to limit travel by putting those West Coast games together, right? Oregon plays Washington on the road, Purdue plays Oregon and Washington on the road in the same week. When USC and UCLA come here, they'll play Purdue and IU in the same week. Illinois, Northwestern. They'll try to get as many of those games through in a swing as possible. But this is, in some ways, a schedule loss, right? Because Purdue is not used to having to go that far away for 2 conference games and then come back home and play a team like Ohio State that all of a sudden starts to jumpstart. And of course, if Purdue's shooting poorly, that's on them. But again, there's wear and tear. It didn't feel like they had the intensity and the manpower to keep up with Ohio State, which is not typically an issue that you see with Purdue. And I think that has something to do with just how much they've been traveling in the last few weeks. So now they have a bit of a homestand, right? They just played Ohio State. They'll play Michigan at home. We'll talk about that game next week on the 31st. They'll play IU for the first time. So Purdue has some time at home, or at least a time in their home state, which is going to allow them to kind of get back in a groove. But they picked up 2 wins on the West Coast swing. They picked up a big one on the road against a ranked team in Oregon. They go out there, pick up a couple wins, come back, and suffer the consequences. Ohio State, again, was hungry for a win. They put their best basketball on the floor and really just showed how deep the Big Ten can be, because Ohio State, not nearly one of the top teams in the conference, but when on their best day, playing their best basketball, they were able to beat one of the top teams in the conference that I would consider to be still contending for a Big Ten championship. It's a disappointing loss, but Purdue played well, shot poorly. Again, intensity, manpower, they just didn't have what they needed to have to beat Ohio State, and I think part of that has to do with where this Ohio State game fell on the schedule. Let's talk about the Michigan game. Michigan is 14-4. They're 6-1 in the Big Ten. That places them second. They're 1 game between Michigan State and Purdue. So really, they're where Purdue was last week before this Ohio State game, where Michigan State's leading the Big Ten. They're undefeated. They're, I believe, 7-0. Purdue is now has 2 losses in the Big Ten. So Michigan's right there in the middle. If they lose, then they're slipping back past second place, and they really are giving Michigan State a lead. If they win, then similar to where Purdue would have been last week, if they'd beaten Ohio State, they'd still be a game back, just hounding Michigan, waiting for Michigan to drop a game here or there. There again, Michigan's a game between Michigan State and Purdue. 14-4, 6-1, second in the Big Ten. They're 3-1 against the top 25. So this is a legitimate team in Michigan. All right, sometimes there's teams at the top. Indiana's way higher in the Big Ten standings than they will end up being by the end of the season. But you've got teams up there that maybe have had some easier conference schedules. Michigan's a legit team. 3-1 against the top 25. That is a much better percentage than Purdue has at the moment. Recently, they blew out Washington. They had an overtime loss to Minnesota, and then an overtime win over Northwestern. So Michigan has been shaky as of recently. They were undefeated in the Big Ten. They were right up there, tied with Michigan State. And then many of you know about that overtime loss to Minnesota on the road that dropped them just a game below. So Michigan, again, 3-1 against top 25, very considerably strong team in the Big Ten, but has been shaky recently with those losses, or with that loss to Minnesota and with that just narrow win over Northwestern. Very fast start to the year and a shaky decline recently. Now, the number one quality, the number one trait that Michigan harbors is a pair of dominant centers. They have 2 7-footers that dominate the front court. You've got Vladislav Golden, you've got Danny Wolf. Golden averages 16 and 6. Wolf averages 12 and 10. He's averaging a double-double, which is ridiculous, which really makes this game in the front court Trakoff and Wren against the world, right? Because Trakoff and Wren, for the most part, down low has been on his own. We haven't quite seen the production from Caleb Furst that we maybe would want to. And there's really not another big man down there for Purdue, now that Zach Edey is gone, that can pair with Trakoff and Wren to take on some of these combinations. So it's 2 centers. So either they're both going to be on the floor and Trakoff and Wren is overwhelmed, or if they're being subbed out and there's only one of them on the floor at a time, then there's constant fresh legs, and TKR is always going to be the slightly more worn down player in the front court, and he's really all alone. TKR is down there on that part of the floor. Obviously, Purdue has people they can sub in to that position, but for the most part, Trakoff and Wren is the only truly consistently productive player in the front court across the board. He beat out Biddle with no issue. We're talking about Oregon center Nate Biddle. Trakoff and Wren, in terms of the front court play, dominated Nate Biddle. No issues there. But will he succeed against Michigan when there's 2 of them? And again, it doesn't matter. It's an advantage for Michigan whether they're both on the floor or only one of them is on the floor at a time between Golden and Wolf. So Trakoff and Wren against the world down low, and this is a similar conversation to what we're having about the Pacers as they play the Spurs, is that the shooting has to improve because Purdue has shot poorly recently. Again, they were under 50% from the field against Ohio State. They were under 50% from the field, I believe, both times against Washington and Oregon. And especially knowing that Trakoff and Wren is going to be facing an uphill battle, Purdue is going to have to shoot well in this game at home. Get the crowd behind you, get some shots up early, get some shots to fall early. They've been slumping recently, especially from 3. Some terrible numbers from the 3-point line for Purdue recently. It's been permissible because Trakoff and Wren has kept the team afloat down low, and they're playing some inferior opponents. But in the Pacific time zone, it was permissible, right? Playing Oregon, playing Washington. But now in Mackey, it's not so much as an acceptable of a failure because, again, you're in your own building. You're not time zones away, right? This is a position where Purdue should be able to shoot well, play well against a ranked team and against a team technically better than you in terms of the Big Ten standings. If Trakoff and Wren is going to be overwhelmed by Golden and Wolf, then the backcourt shooting is going to have to improve from Purdue, similar to the conversation we're having about the Pacers. This, to me, is a must-win game. Purdue's in 3rd place. This would be their 3rd conference loss. That's just 1 conference loss above where IU is at this moment. That loss to Penn State is really hurting Purdue at the moment. So they lost to Penn State. They lost to Ohio State. Those are 2 unranked teams below them. Purdue still has some tough games left to go, right? Michigan is a great example. IU, I suppose, is always a difficult game. Michigan State will be difficult. Purdue plays Illinois at the end of the year. Purdue has more ranked opponents that they're going to have to play throughout the schedule, and so far they've been losing to teams that are arguably inferior to them and below them in the Big Ten standings, below them in just about every metric across the board. So to stay in contention for the regular season title, this is, to me, a must-win game at home because there's maybe 12 games left in the season. If they lose, they'd be 3 games behind Michigan State. And yeah, they still play Michigan State, and there's plenty of time in between then for teams to win and lose and for things to ebb and flow. But if Purdue's looking for another regular season Big Ten title, this is a must-win game to me at home against a ranked team in Michigan. Again, it's Trakoff and Wren versus a pair of centers. It's an uphill battle in the front court for the Boilermakers, so the backcourt's going to have to pick up that slack. Braden Smith, it's a great time for Braden Smith takeover game where he drops 30-plus, and all the Instagram posts just have his face on it, and Braden Smith really takes over and beats this team on his own. But whether it's Braden Smith, Fletcher Lawyer, CJ Cox, this team is going to need to have shooters shoot from the backcourt, from around the three-point line, from the field as a whole. This is the time for those guards like Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer to really shine as we've seen them do throughout this season at different points. It's an uphill battle for TKR down low, pick up the slack in the backcourt, start hot, win the crowd, and keep it. That was the big problem against Ohio State. Purdue, at home, they started with a lead, right? They had the crowd at their backs, of course, but Ohio State started to creep back into it, and at that point, Purdue just really, there was nothing they could do, and yeah, they kept it close, but late in that game, Ohio State put themselves in the position to have the advantage in late possessions, and they ended up parlaying that into a win. So start hot, win the crowd, and keep the lead. Maintain an 8-point lead. Treat winning by 8 as a tie game, right? Where you got to have the intensity and you've got to have the urgency to appreciate that 8-point lead and stay ahead by 2 possessions, 3 possessions, whatever the number may be. That's what we're going to need to see if Purdue's going to win at home against Michigan and not lose a second game at home in 500,000 games. Stay in contention for Big Ten regular season title. This is a massive game in the Big Ten for the Purdue Boilermakers as they look to stay in contention for Big Ten regular season title. Again, it's going to be an uphill battle in the front court. The backcourt's got to pick up the slack. We'll see how it goes. I'm very excited to watch it all play out this Friday.